Why is the United States obsessed with a country that has more inflation than a balloon factory? It's not about democracy, it's about the forbidden brine. All right, listen up, you soggy cucumbers, because the jar is shaking, and it's not because someone is trying to open the lid. We need to talk about the absolute briny mess that is the tension between the United States of Gherkins and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Now, you might be floating there thinking that this is just another political spat between two pickles who don't like each other's seasoning, but it is infinitely more complicated and greasy than that. The United States has a long, illustrious history of looking at other jars on the shelf, deciding they have too much delicious juice, and then aggressively liberating that juice in the name of freedom and democracy. Venezuela is currently sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the entire pantry, and the U.S. military-industrial complex is looking at that oil like a drunk man looks at a kebab at 3 a.m. We are talking about a potential intervention that could turn the entire South American shelf into a spicy relish of chaos, hyperinflation, and geopolitical nightmares. So grab your floaties, because we are diving deep into the vinegar to understand why Uncle Sam might be sharpening his knife for a very specific Latin American dill. Let's start with the main course, which is obviously the black gold, the Texas tea, or as we call it in the jar, the forbidden brine. Venezuela has more oil underground than Saudi Arabia, but there is a massive sticky catch that nobody talks about on the news. The oil in Venezuela is extra heavy crude, which means it is basically molasses mixed with asphalt, and it requires a tremendous amount of specialized refining to turn it into gasoline. For decades, the U.S. was the main customer because the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries were specifically built to process this sludge, creating a symbiotic relationship where the U.S. bought the oil and Venezuela used the money to buy, well, everything else. But then, the political leadership in Venezuela decided they wanted to seize the means of production, or in our terms, take back the pickle factory, which really annoyed the foreign investors who built the equipment. This led to a slow decline in production because, surprise, surprise, maintaining oil infrastructure is harder than pickling an egg. Now, the U.S. sees this failing infrastructure and thinks, hey, that looks like a job for democracy, which is code for Chevron and Exxon wanting their keys back. Now we have to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the starving pickle in the pantry, which is the economic collapse that turned the Venezuelan currency into literal confetti. We are talking about hyperinflation that makes the Weimar Republic look like a model of fiscal responsibility, where you need a wheelbarrow of cash just to buy a single roll of toilet paper. The government tried to fix this by printing more money, which works about as well as trying to put out a fire by dousing it with gasoline. This economic weakness is the exact vulnerability the U.S. preys upon, using sanctions to tighten the screws until the lid pops off. The U.S. Treasury Department, which is basically a wizard with a spreadsheet, froze Venezuelan assets abroad, effectively locking the country's wallet and throwing the key into the Potomac River. This means Venezuela can't import food, medicine, or the spare parts needed to fix the oil rigs, creating a death spiral that the U.S. blames on socialism, and the Venezuelan government blames on imperialism. The truth, as usual, is a disgusting sandwich made of both incompetence and external sabotage. So, how would an actual attack go down, assuming the U.S. decides to stop playing nice and starts playing risk? Well, it wouldn't be a Desert Storm tank rush, because Venezuela is a geographical nightmare consisting of dense jungles, mountains, and urban sprawls that would make a logistics officer cry himself to sleep. An invasion would likely start with a massive air campaign to neutralize air defenses, followed by a naval blockade to completely starve the country of any incoming goods. But putting boots on the ground is where it gets spicy because the Venezuelan military, while underfunded, has been preparing for exactly this scenario for 20 years. They have distributed weapons to civilian militias, meaning every street corner could turn into a prickly ambush. It would be an asymmetrical war of attrition, a guerrilla grindhouse that the U.S. public has zero appetite for. The U.S. military knows this, which is why they prefer the shadow war approach. Cyber attacks, funding opposition groups, and maybe a drone strike or two just to keep things interesting. It's less D-Day and more death by 1,000 cuts while hoping the government collapses from the inside. But wait, there's more. Because we cannot forget the global roommates who also have a stake in this briny drama, Russia and China. These two superpowers have loaned Venezuela billions of dollars, And they are not about to let the US just walk in and foreclose on their investment. Russia has sent bombers and military advisors to Venezuela in the past, basically parking a tank on America's front lawn just to prove a point. China, on the other hand, has been buying up the oil and infrastructure debts, effectively owning the mortgage on the house while the US tries to evict the tenant. If the US attacks, it risks a direct confrontation with nuclear-armed powers, turning a regional conflict into World War III. The Pickle Edition. This geopolitical standoff acts as a shield for Venezuela, because even the most hawkish US general has to think twice before shooting at a target that might have a Russian advisor standing next to it. It's a delicate game of chicken played with nuclear missiles and barrels of sludge. Let's pivot to the internal chaos, specifically the opposition leaders that the US keeps trying to prop up like a weekend at Bernie's situation. We had the Juan Guaido saga, where the US recognized him as the president, even though he had zero control over the military or the bureaucracy, which is like me declaring myself king of the fridge just because I put a sticker on my forehead. The US strategy relies on the Venezuelan military defecting, but the top brass of the army controls the distribution of food and imports, meaning they are getting rich off the corruption and have zero incentive to switch sides. It is a classic mafia structure where loyalty is bought with access to the few remaining dollars in the economy. So when the US sanctions the country, it hurts the average Jose on the street. But the generals are still eating caviar and drinking imported vodka. This disconnect between the freedom narrative and the reality of corruption is why the regime has survived for so long despite being totally incompetent at governing. We also have to talk about the refugee crisis, which is the direct result of this economic strangulation and political repression. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, walking thousands of miles to escape the hunger, creating a humanitarian disaster that destabilizes the entire region. The US claims to care about these people, yet maintains policies that make their home unlivable, which is the geopolitical equivalent of punching someone in the face and then offering them an ice pack. Neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil are overwhelmed, and this instability breeds crime, drug trafficking, and more radicalization. If the US were to actually invade, this refugee flow would turn into a tsunami, creating a migration crisis that would make the current situation look like a picnic. It creates a perverse incentive where keeping the dictator in power might actually be more stable for the region than the chaos of removing him, a lesson the US refuses to learn despite failing that exact class in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. Finally, we have to consider the domestic US angle, because everything in American politics is actually about winning Florida. Florida is home to a massive population of Venezuelan and Cuban exiles who hate the socialist regime with the fire of 1,000 suns. US politicians from both parties pander to this demographic by talking tough and promising to liberate Venezuela, because winning those votes is key to the Electoral College. It is foreign policy dictated by domestic polling, which is the most dangerous way to run a superpower. They promise regime change to get votes in Miami, but they don't want to commit the troops because that loses votes in Ohio. So we end up with this half-measure strategy of crippling sanctions and covert ops that destroys the country without actually changing the government. It is a cynical game where the people of Venezuela are just pawns on a chessboard that is actually located in a retirement community in Boca Raton. So there you have it, the sad, spicy, and incredibly complex reality of why the US attacks Venezuela. Economically, if not yet militarily, it is a toxic stew of oil greed, Cold War hangovers, domestic political pandering, and a humanitarian crisis that no one actually wants to solve. The US wants the oil but doesn't want the war. The Venezuelan government wants the power but doesn't care about the people. And the global superpowers are just happy to watch the US squirm. In the end, the average pickle is the one getting crunched. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brine of geopolitics, make sure to smash that subscribe button like it's a socialist economy. Ring the bell for notifications so you don't miss the next invasion, and leave a comment below telling me which country we should pickle next. Stay salty, my friends.